Well, that's the wild part, right? That level of propaganda was built into the framework of the language that they were using to discuss this, and they continue to use that language. Here's Trump again, and this is another part of the press conference. And in this one, he is talking about a ceasefire, but he's talking about it. I want to go to the language, and I want to get your take on the way he's talking about it.
Well, he's going to have to do what he has to do, but, his poll numbers aren't particularly great, to put it mildly. He's got a country where, it's been savaged and attacked. And he's got an army that's been very, very brave, actually, despite the fact that, we've given him, in my opinion, $350 billion. That's what the real number is. You don't hear that number. And Europe has given, in my opinion, $100 billion. And they've done it in the form of a loan. And I have a Secretary of Treasury right now who's actually quite...
It's not exactly the clip that I wanted to play, but either way, go into this thing of a ceasefire, because Trump in this press conference points out that Russia doesn't want this to go for 6 months and then another conflict starts, kind of like Syria, where it's this kind of frozen conflict. And as the frozen conflict goes, people get the sense that it's over with, but it springs back up at any particular moment. He said, okay, well, that's a non-starter. Putin doesn't want that. And when I heard him say that, I was like, thank you. At the very least, all of this talk about freezing the conflict along the lines to which they are frozen seems to be now off the table. If Trump is indeed right that Russia doesn't want that, and Trump is acknowledging that Russia doesn't want that. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. This is, again, like I said, the Keith Kellogg plan's over. Yeah. The idea that we were going to force Russia into making concessions is over. Trump recognizes that. This is what 3 weeks of, running into reality will do to your your plan. And so what Trump is saying, in essence, is that this war will end on Russian terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which is big. Yeah, it's huge, but it's real. It's the most realistic thing possible. And I also think what he's saying is that Russia's terms aren't that unrealistic, meaning that they're actually common sense. When you listen to him, he's not like saying, well, Putin's ridiculous, Putin's outrageous. He's like, yeah, who wants this war to come back in 6 months? When we do this, it needs to be over, permanently over. This is real. Ukraine and NATO, it's never going to happen. The 2014 borders, no. I mean, we're going to talk about real here. And again, I think what's going to happen is, Trump understands that whatever peace agreement that comes out has to be permanent, binding, and comprehensive. That this isn't going to be a Band-Aid. This isn't going to be, we've got arterial bleeding. We're going to put, a Band-Aid on it. So you don't see the blood spurting, but eventually that Band-Aid's going to fail and the blood's going to spurt. No, you gotta stop the bleeding, heal the artery, and fix the wound. That's what has to happen. And that can't happen unless Russia wants it to happen, or Russia could be compelled into accepting something. There is no leverage of compulsion. Yeah. The Ukrainians can't do it. Europe can't do it. America can't do it. Doesn't want to do it. And so I think basically what Donald Trump is finally recognizing the reality of the situation. And I'm also encouraged by his, talking about Russia as an ally, bringing up, the fact that we fought side by side in a war. Thank God somebody remembers this. And I would hope, and it might be fanciful thinking, but I would love to see Donald Trump send a high-level delegation, including American troops, to Moscow on May 9th to march in the Victory Day parade, not as a celebration of Russian victory over Ukraine, but a celebration of the Allied victory over Nazi Germany. Man, that would put us right back on the path we need to be on.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that one. Definitely. I'm curious on what do you think this looks like at the end? Meaning, what is this when they end this? Because at this point, Trump is talking about meeting in Saudi Arabia, but he also said Putin coming to Washington, D.C., and him going to Moscow. That has not necessarily been heavily reported, or at the very least not focused on. I focused on it because I think that's a big deal. Vladimir Putin stepping on American soil. That is mind-blowing. For one, do you think that's going to happen? I guess we could start with that. And B, the significance of that. And maybe that's not really the question I want to go to. I think I want to get your take on that. But first, I want to get your take on, what does it look like? What is the agreement that they need to make in order to make this work? Because they asked him, well, what about pulling weapons away? He's like, well, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to kill my ability to negotiate. And I said, well, okay, that makes sense. He wants to keep a pressure, even if that pressure is getting weaker. He wants that pressure there to be part of the negotiation that he has with Vladimir Putin. So what do you think America gives, and what do you think America gets in any negotiation that takes place between these two?
Well, the biggest thing America gets and what America wants is stability in Europe that allow them to unplug and redirect resources to the Pacific. That's the big get here. It has to be done. It has to be done in a way that is politically viable. But I don't think it needs to be done in a way that preserves what Trump believes are corrupt European hierarchies. Trump's not here to preserve and protect the European Union. Trump's not here to expand and strengthen NATO. In fact, I think there's a growing recognition in the Trump administration that NATO is a Cold War artifact that needs to be jettisoned. It makes no sense from any standpoint. If the United States is going to unplug from Europe, that means that we have to get out of a situation where, because of the irresponsible policies of European nations, we could find ourselves in a war with Russia because of Article 5. We're just not going to. Trump is not going to allow the Article 5 trap to be held over America's head anymore.
Right.
And so it's a renegotiation with Europe about what European security looks like, and it's done in a context where Russia is not going to be, posed as the threat that unifies European resolve. By ending this conflict in Ukraine, Trump seeks to not only normalize Russian-U.S. relations, but also letting Europe know that the path forward requires Europe to normalize relations with Russia as well, that Europe can't sit there and hide behind an American shield that Trump is no longer willing to keep in place. We don't want war with Russia. That's the big takeaway here. We don't want war with Russia. And right now there's a great potential not to have a war with Russia. This is what European security framework looks like. Europe is going to have to learn to live within its means. I mean, if you can't afford 2% for NATO, then don't think about jettisoning NATO and creating this whole new big European army. It doesn't exist. I think Europe has to start talking with Russia from the standpoint of individual sovereign states. Whatever problem Poland has with Russia, Poland needs to solve. Whatever problem the Baltics have with Russia, the Baltics need to solve. I feel sorry for Finland and Sweden jumping on board this Titanic. I mean, they're just running in. We got the ticket. We got the ticket. We're on board. Yeah. You hit an iceberg. Damn. Going down quick, isn't it? Yeah. Good luck, Finland. Burning all your bridges with Russia was the genius move. And the Swedes, you guys are stupid. That's okay. Russia will allow them to, fix the error of their ways. But you're going to see individual nations will have to deal with Russia as individual nations. This artifice called the European Union, this artifice called NATO, is no longer going to be the primary, interlocutor with Russia, between Russia and Europe. And I think this changes everything for the better. It does mean that Russia is a dominant power. Look at a map. I mean, if you haven't figured it out yet, Russia is a dominant power. It's a huge landmass, tremendous amount of resources, and no amount of European, fantasy is going to change that. Europe can't sit there and say, because we stand together, Russia is weak. No, Russia will always be strong. The best way to deal with a strong neighbor like that is to have sound, mutually beneficial relations based upon economic principles of cooperation, as opposed to trying to promote artificial military confrontation that you can't afford and sustain. You're not going to beat Russia in a war. That just isn't going to happen. So why waste money, resources, effort, everything on posturing that that's what you want? This is what a new European security framework will look like, is to walk away from the militarism of the Cold War era and enter a new dynamic of economic competition, if you want it to be, but cooperation by necessity. This is the way that BRICS is looking at the world, and Europe needs to get on board with BRICS, maybe not join BRICS, but at least understand that the way nations will work together is through economic interaction. That the day of a militarized approach towards solving the disputes is finished, because no nation can afford this war anymore.
Yeah.
Russia can't even afford this war anymore. I mean, let's just be honest about it. Russia won this war, but Russia also is looking at it saying, this is unsustainable. This is unsustainable. The posture we've taken here to prevail in Ukraine is unsustainable. It's not the posture we want to be engaged in. And Donald Trump is looking at it too. The Pentagon, they're talking about strength, but the Pentagon's also talking about, we need to start cutting the budget. We need to start spending, we can't be spending all this money. That's one of the great revelations. And the way you justify defense reductions is to remove artificial militarism from your national thought process. And there is nothing more artificially militaristic in the United States posture in the world today than what we're doing in Europe. NATO, this fake conflict in Ukraine. It's not fake because people are dying, but it didn't need to happen. There was no reason for this to happen. We could have said no to NATO from the very beginning and prevented this war. This is the fake aspect of it. It's an artificial confrontation that doesn't need to happen, has no historical basis other than, failed Cold War mentality. It's time to get Europe back on the path of learning to live in peace with its Russian neighbor.
This is somewhat of an odd question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I had the opportunity to go to the Biden-Putin summit. This took place in Geneva, Switzerland. And I remember being somewhat hopeful in the language that was being used by Biden and by Putin, because at a certain point, it sounded like they were saying very similar things. The guy, my boss, who was with me, completely cynical about the entire process, was like, this is not going to matter. It doesn't matter what they're saying. It doesn't matter what's coming out their mouth. It's not going to change the relationship. And he was right. It fell apart. Like within months, it just fell apart. Are you hopeful about this one, though? That this is something that is going to last, that is something that they're serious about, and that the outcome is going to be something that A, stops these people from dying, and B, makes a new norm in relations between Russia and the United States?
100%. The thing about the Biden-Putin summit is that Biden wasn't willing to recognize that the problem was the structures that existed, NATO's posturing, the inability of France and Germany to go forward with Minsk, the NATO presence in Ukraine, everything that created the problem, Biden wasn't willing to deal with. He was just, his solution was literally came down to this, and you were there, this. Russia must realize that China is its primary enemy, and therefore Russia must submit to the West and the will of the West and do what the West wants and the West will save Russia from China. That was the Biden takeaway. I'm right. Know I'm right. You saw him say that.
They were literally making that argument, and it was the dumbest
only argument they had. Everything else they're saying, Russia, you're wrong. No, they lied. I mean, Biden lied to Putin. He said, I will get Tony Blinken to work with the Germans and the French on implementation of Minsk. Because Putin said, we need to get Minsk in play. That's what will make all this work. It was in June that they had their meeting. By September, Blinken was having secret meetings with Europe and Ukraine to send offensive weapons to Ukraine, because he knew that there wasn't going to be any Minsk, because Biden wasn't serious about it. It was just Biden lied one more time. The difference between then and now is that Trump is recognizing the foundational causes for Russian-American animosity: NATO, Europe, Ukraine. And he's addressing all of these in a way that Biden never did. Trump isn't just talking about meeting with Putin and, French kissing in Red Square. Trump is talking about solving the fundamental underlying problems, number one of which is Ukraine and NATO. I mean, he said there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine. Imagine if Biden had said that back in June of 2021, where we'd be today. So that's the difference between the two approaches. Trump recognizes that there are fundamental problems in how the West interacts with Russia. And he is looking to change those fundamental problems, not just come up with a solution, but a lasting solution. And that's the difference. And the other thing is that Trump isn't, for the first time, we have an American president that is actually doing what John F. Kennedy said had to be done if you're going to have normalized relations. Put yourself in their shoes. I mean, imagine Joe Biden going, well, from Putin's perspective, you can't do that. That's, Putin has said this, the Russians have said that, and that's a sound, I sort of agree with him. Biden never did that. Biden never went, the whole thing was Putin is an evil, brutal dictator. I looked him in the eyes and I saw evil. I mean, come on. This is the completely different approach. And it's one that the establishment can't handle. I mean, I love the fact that my favorite CIA Russian analysts, and I put favorite in quotations, are all out there right now just freaking out. These are people that spent the last 30 years writing PhD type theses about the evil relationship, evil nature of Putin, this, that, and the other thing, how Russia can't be trusted, And they're waking up to a new reality where a president of the United States is actually saying, well, the Russian leader has a point. The Russian perspective, from the Russian point of view, because see, they were never Russian experts. The problem with bringing in and interjecting the Russian point of view means that you have to acknowledge that Russia exists, that Russia has a right to a point of view, and that their point of view might be grounded in history related to Russian reality. None of these CIA intelligence, community Russian experts do that. They start with the premise that Putin is evil. Russia is this nation of zombies that just does whatever Putin wants them to do. And if you don't treat Russia in this way, then Russia will overwhelm you and defeat you and eat you up and spit you out. We finally have a president who's dealing with the Russian reality. It's early on. Whether or not he can follow through is a big question, but it is such a different approach than the one that Biden took in the the Helsinki, or not the Helsinki, I'm sorry, the Geneva summit in 2021. So I'm optimistic because it's the right thing. I mean, when I've been saying this all along. I mean, I've joked with you in the past, hey, call me. This is exactly what I would be advising him to do. Exactly what I would be advising him to do, because it's the only path that will work. If you know the Russians, and I'm trying to know the Russians, I don't claim to have absolute knowledge and insight, but I've made an effort to know the Russians. If you look at it from a Russian perspective, these are reasonable actions that aren't designed to promote Russian hegemony on the world, but to secure Russia's legitimate national security, legitimate national interests. And finally, we have an American president who's putting himself in Putin's position going, yeah, it makes sense. That makes sense.
Scott, always appreciate you, my man. Scott Ritter, he is a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. Scott, where can people find you? I want to make sure that people can get your analysis on these issues.
Well, I mean, scottritter.com is the one-stop shop. There you'll get videos. For instance, you'll give me a link. I'll put it up there for this. I have a Substack. You can gain access to that. It's a subscription, but the subscription's free. You don't have to make it free. You can do a paid subscription if you like. That helps me continue to do my work. But and then if you give me a second, I just started a new project called the Russia House with Scott Ritter on Telegram. Basically it's a follow-up on a project I had been doing previously called the Scott Ritter Show, where I would interview prominent Russian academics, politicians, military people, etc., about issues and try and get the Russian point of view, the Russian perspective on this through a Western filter, so that that I'm speaking to a Western audience. That got shut down because of the U.S. Treasury Department basically made it impossible to do that kind of work. So I've got a wonderful collaborator in Russia. We've come up with this this new venture, the Russia House with Scott Ritter. It's on my Telegram channel. It is a subscription-based service because it has to be sustainable because of the unique aspects of the U.S.-Russian reality for the moment. But we've already done a number of interviews. We're publishing our second interview today about the Russian-Chechen relationship. Last week we talked about the Ukraine-Russian conflict and the future of drone warfare, and we'll be continue to go forward getting the Russian perspective. So if people want to learn more about Russia, there's not a better time than now to try and get insight into the Russian perspective. The Russia House with Scott Ritter on my Telegram channel would be a good place to go.
Scott, man, I deeply appreciate you joining me. Be safe, my man. Have a good one.
Thanks.
All right.